While it seemed like the British were all alone, they really weren't all alone. Other smaller countries had joined the effort in support of the Allies. Japan, Germany, and Italy signed the Tripactor, bringing their alliance even closer together. The Soviets' war with Finland presented the world the military incompetence of the Soviet Union, but ultimately Finland had to sue for peace. Allies tried to take key ports on the coast of Africa, but that didn't go very well for them. After all this great German success, Mussolini decided now it was time for Italy's moment in the spotlight. He took small British islands and then decided to take Egypt, but that went bad. And then tried Greece, which went horribly bad. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill began to refer to Italy as the soft underbelly of the Axis. Churchill began a military campaign from the south and began to send troops to Greece. Italy's failures worried Hitler, and he quickly moved to protect his southern flag by forcing Hungary to sign the Tripartite Act and join the Axis side. When the war first broke out, the people were against intervening in the United States. In 1940, there was an election. Sitting President Franklin Delano Roosevelt said he would send 0 troops to fight in the war unless he had to. Then he might. But the Republican nominee, Wendell Willkie, said he would never do it, and FDR won. Churchill then asked FDR to join the war efforts. FDR said he could have some supplies, so the US began sending supplies over to the UK to help them in the war. They sent the Allies ammunition, food supplies, and other stuff, but the ships were constantly being sunk by the German U-boats. If the Germans could cut off the supply chain, then Britain wouldn't last and would fall to Germany. The US had to develop better technology, improve radar, better convoy tactics to continue supplying the Allies. Alan Turing and his team of codebreakers cracked Germany's Enigma code, and the U-boats began to fade out. British forces began to push Italy out of Egypt, and Hitler knew he had to send troops to make sure Egypt would stay in his control. He sent troops to Yugoslavia and Bulgaria. Bulgaria decided to join the Axis side. Yugoslavia decided to be invaded. Greece then fell to the German-Italian invasion. British had sent troops from Egypt to protect Greece, which allowed the German-Italian invasion to push the British out of Egypt. They would have kept going if it weren't for a small Australian force that was holding out in Tobruk for 8 months. Hey, Soviet Union, boom, you're now getting invaded. The Germans finally launched a massive attack on the Soviet Union, an attack Hitler had been dying to get through. Millions of troops began to push their way to the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin was not ready for this at all, despite the warnings by FDR and Churchill. Instead, Stalin chose to stick his head up his ass. Germany took hundreds of thousands of Soviets through their encircling strategy. Leningrad would be under siege for an unbearable 8 months. The Eastern Front saw the most vicious fighting in the war. The Germans were now right outside of Moscow, and that was it. It's all over. But then it got cold. Really, really cold. Hitler had hoped the Soviets would have just given up by now, so he did not supply his troops with materials needed to fight in such extreme conditions. His commanders wanted to wait till spring to continue their attack since the oil was freezing and their horses kept dying, but Hitler said, no, keep going. Stalin then sent in troops specifically trained to fight in such harsh conditions from Siberia to fight the Germans. The Soviets now had the advantage and began to push Germany out of the Soviet territory. Hitler finally allowed for them to stop the attack for now and wait till spring to continue the fight. Over in Japan, the war with China had come to a stalemate. They also wanted to continue to expand their influence in other places as well as gain those sweet natural resources. They wanted to expand south, but the issue was that the islands to the south were occupied by the US. This meant the Navy were there, meaning they were no match for them. They decided in order to take over those lands, they needed to destroy their naval force before they came to the islands. On December 8th, 1941, Japanese forces bombed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. They inflicted a ton of damage on the US Pacific Fleet and attacked British colonies in Southeast Asia. The US and British declared war on Japan the following day, and for some odd reason, Germany decided to declare war on America, even though they really didn't have to. Man, why does Hitler love to shoot himself in the foot? The attack on Pearl Harbor seemed like a massive success for Japan, but they all failed to attack any of the naval repair yards, fuel storage tanks, meaning the Pacific Fleet would be up and running soon after the attack. The Japanese were able to begin their conquest, taking Guam, the Gilbert Islands, Wake Islands, Hong Kong, and more. While these all seem like great victories, it is important to note that they were all through speed and not power. And as we will quickly learn, they were no match to the power of the United States. For the people living in the occupied nations, they felt brutal oppression from the countries occupying them. The most The most well-known example would have to be in Europe, where Germans were rounding up millions of Jewish people and other ethnic groups and putting them in the harsh concentration camps, where millions would die in the Holocaust. The living conditions were horrible, as the people suffered through harsh labor from the Germans every day and were fed very little. Many died of starvation, while others were outright executed through the infernos, gas chambers, and other methods used by the Germans. Over 6 million died in the camps. Millions had their lives destroyed by this. Families were broken apart, never to be reunited again, and loved ones died. Brave resistant groups rose up to their oppressors in an effort to stop the brutality they were witnessing. Winter was now finally over. That meant Hitler could continue his attack on the Soviets. Hitler wanted to take particular areas in the Soviet territory in the south that were full of oil so he could take all the oil for himself. The army breezed through the north, and Hitler got a bit arrogant. He rerouted the 4th Army early, leaving the 6th Army by themselves to complete the encircling movement in the key city of Stalingrad, all by themselves. The Soviets held the Germans in Stalingrad for 5 months of the ruthless fighting. They were unable to encircle the 6th Army, similar to Hitler's strategy he used in France. Instead of retreating, Hitler shot himself in the foot yet again, like he loves to do in this war, and told his men to keep moving and fighting. The 6th Army was trapped and surrendered to the Soviets. The Soviets, with complete air superiority, began to push Germans out of the Soviet Union. Ultimately, Hitler's invasion was a disaster as he lost all momentum going for him at the time. To make things worse, now America had joined in the fighting and would begin to attack. Cities in Germany were bombed a lot more frequently now and a lot more viciously as well. German forces were being pushed out of Africa after both sides traded momentum. Japan saw the momentum also shrink as they were unable to take the islands of Midway, Somme, and New Guinea. With the Axis now out of Africa, the Allies needed to figure out their next move. The Allies began to attack through southern Italy and bomb Rome. As this was happening, the Italian people began to grow unhappy and restless at the war and Mussolini himself. Mussolini was voted out of his own fascist Grand Council and was toppled from power. Italy began to negotiate out of the war. Hitler was not overly shocked by this. The Allies pushed them to the middle of the country, but winter came and went into a stalemate. The Allies then decided to attack the Axis from the north, and in U.S. General Dwight D. Eisenhower drew up plans for an invasion. They decided to land on Normandy, since the Axis powers wouldn't expect them to land on that island. So, on June 6, 1944, the Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy in the D-Day invasion. The landings were brutal for all involved, but was a massive success for the Allies. The Allies began to surround the Germans on all sides as they encircled and trapped the German forces. The southern attack made it through Italy later in 1944 and into France, as the Soviets began to push their way into Germany. The Allies began to push Germany out of France and began to attack Germany. As the Allies were making their way through, they liberated all the concentration camps there. And the horrific details of what was going on in those camps were now being spread throughout the world. Hitler at this point was now desperate and decided to use his blitzkrieg strategy he used on the French to try and stop the Allies' advances. He used all his strength and just threw his forces at them, and they were able to capture a small Allied force, but they were able to break free. After this failed, the Germans continued to get pushed back more and more. The Soviets took Warsaw and Berlin as the other side of the country fell. In his bunker, Hitler decided instead of shooting himself in the foot this time, he would shoot himself in the head. So, in his bunker, Hitler and his wife killed themselves as Germany fell. The war in Europe was now finally over. In Asia, Japan were being pushed out of the islands as the US hopped from island to island, taking them. The fighting got worse on each island as the Japanese showed no signs of quitting, as they felt surrendering was the most dishonorable thing a man could do. By this time, US President FDR had died, and his vice president, Harry Truman, took over as president in early April. Many of Japan were not going to surrender in the war, though some claimed they were ready to. Truman did not see that, and he launched the first atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing hundreds of thousands of people in the process. This would be the first and last time a country would nuke another country. On September 14th, the Japanese surrendered, ending World War II. After a brutal 6 years of fighting, the war was now finally over. Japan was allowed to keep their emperor after the war. However, there was a particular picture with General MacArthur and the emperor that they made sure they had to take. Germany would then be split up into two parts, East Germany and West. The US and UK occupied the West, while the Soviets occupied the East. The Second World War was more deadlier and devastating than the first one. After World War II, we saw the rise of two superpowers in the US and the Soviet Union, and they would introduce a new kind of war. How should I put it? Oh yeah, cold. A Cold War.